She had 36 hours before they would tie her to a man she didn't love. 36 hours before her father's debts would be paid with her future. Standing in the dust of her family's crumbling ranch, Lila Carter watched the only man she'd ever wanted ride toward the horizon, unaware that tomorrow she'd belong to someone else. 7 years of silence, 7 years of stolen glances and swallowed words. But tonight, something inside her broke. And when a woman with nothing left to lose finally speaks her truth, the whole world has to answer. If you want to see how far love can run when everything's against it, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The sun beat down on the Texas prairie like a hammer on an anvil, merciless and unrelenting. Heat shimmered above the parched earth, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage of false promises. Lila Carter stood on the sagging porch of her family's ranch house, one hand shading her eyes, watching a lone rider move across the distant ridge. She knew that silhouette, would have known it anywhere. Caleb Boone sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, his broad shoulders squared against the sky, his dark hat pulled low. Even from this distance, even through the distorting heat, she could trace the familiar lines of him, the set of his jaw, the easy way he moved with the animal beneath him, the quiet strength that radiated from every gesture. 7 years. 7 years since the day he'd pulled her from the flooding creek, her dress heavy with water, her lungs burning. 7 years since he'd carried her to shore and laid her gently in the grass, his face hovering above hers, his eyes dark with concern. She'd been 15 then, just a girl. He'd been 22, already a man marked by hard work and harder losses. "You're all right," he'd said, his voice rough but gentle. "You're going to be just fine." She'd believed him then, had gone on believing him through every passing season, every drought and storm, every long Sunday when she'd watch him from across the church aisle and wonder if he ever thought about that day the way she did. Now she was 22 and he was 29, and nothing had changed except everything had changed, and tomorrow her father was going to sign papers that would end any possibility of, "Lila!" Her mother's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. Catherine Carter appeared in the doorway, her face drawn and pale beneath the carefully arranged dark hair already showing threads of silver. She'd once been beautiful. Now she was just tired. "Come inside," her mother said. "We have preparations to make." Preparations. The word tasted like ash. "In a minute," Lila said, not turning from the ridge. But Caleb was already gone, disappeared into the fold of the land like smoke. "Now, Lila." Her mother's tone left no room for argument. "Mrs. Pemberton is coming at 2 to discuss the dress, and your father wants to review the arrangements with you before he sells me like a prize mare?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with a bitterness she could no longer contain. Her mother's face tightened. "That's unfair, and you know it. Your father is trying to save this family by sacrificing me to a stranger." William Garrett is hardly a stranger. He's a successful businessman from Austin, educated, well-connected. "I've met him exactly 3 times. Lila finally turned to face her mother. 3 times, Mother. And each time he looked at me the way men look at horses they're thinking of buying, checking my teeth, probably wondering about my breeding." "Lila Carter, you will not speak this way." Her mother's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "Do you understand what's at stake? Your father owes the bank $14,000. $14,000. If we don't pay by the end of next month, they'll take everything. The ranch, the house, the land that's been in this family for 2 generations. Everything we've built, everything we are, gone. And marrying William Garrett solves this. How exactly?" Her mother's eyes flashed. "He's willing to pay your father's debts as part of the marriage agreement. All of them. In exchange for your hand in a business partnership that will bring in enough income to keep us afloat. It's a good match, Lila. Better than we had any right to hope for." "A good match," Lila laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you call selling your daughter?" "I call it survival." Her mother's voice cracked slightly, and for a moment Lila saw the fear beneath the rigid control. "You think I want this? You think this is how I imagined your future? But we live in a hard world, girl. Love is a luxury we can't afford." The words hung between them, heavy and final. "I'll be in shortly," Lila said quietly, turning back to the empty prairie. She heard her mother sigh, heard the rustle of skirts, heard the door close with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. The ridge where Caleb had been was empty now, just heat and grass and endless sky. But she could still see him in her mind, could still remember every detail of his face from the last time they'd spoken, 3 weeks ago at the general store in town. She'd been loading supplies into the wagon when he'd appeared beside her, taking a heavy sack of flour from her hands. "Let me," he'd said, and she'd stepped back, watching the way his muscles moved beneath his worn shirt as he lifted the weight easily into the wagon bed. "Thank you," she'd managed, and he'd looked at her then, really looked at her. And for a moment she'd thought she saw something in his dark eyes, something more than neighborly courtesy. "How's your father?" he'd asked. "Managing." The lie came automatically. Everyone in town knew the Carters were drowning, but pride demanded they pretend otherwise. "And you?" The question had caught her off guard. Most people asked about her father, the ranch, the family's prospects. No one asked about her. She'd paused, suddenly unable to produce the expected pleasantry. Something about the way he was looking at her, the quiet intensity of his attention, made the usual lies stick in her throat. "I'm here," she'd said finally. He'd studied her face for a long moment, and she'd had the strange feeling he could see straight through to the things she didn't say. Then someone had called his name from inside the store, and the moment had broken. "Take care, Lila," he'd said, touching the brim of his hat. And then he'd been gone, and she'd climbed onto the wagon seat with her hand shaking for reasons she couldn't quite name. 3 weeks ago, before her father had come home with the news about William Garrett, before everything had spiraled from bad to impossible. Now, standing in the afternoon heat with the weight of tomorrow pressing down on her, Lila made a decision. She couldn't marry William Garrett, couldn't spend the rest of her life with a man who made her skin crawl, whose soft hands had never known real work, whose smile was all calculation and no warmth, couldn't lie in a stranger's bed and pretend she didn't dream of someone else. But more than that, deeper than that, she couldn't let another day pass without knowing the truth. Maybe Caleb saw her as nothing more than the girl he'd once pulled from a creek. Maybe those moments when she'd caught him watching her across a room were just her imagination, wishful thinking, born of desperation. Maybe the careful distance he'd always maintained was simple disinterest and not, as she'd sometimes dared to hope, the restraint of a man who wanted something he believed he couldn't have. She needed to know. Even if the answer destroyed her, she needed to know. The afternoon crept by in a haze of forced smiles and hollow preparations. Mrs. Pemberton arrived with fabric samples and talked endlessly about lace and hemlines while Lila sat mute, nodding when expected, her mind miles away. Her father reviewed the contract terms, his voice heavy with relief and shame in equal measure, explaining how the merger of Garrett's capital with the Carter name would create opportunities, how this was best for everyone, how she'd come to see the wisdom of it in time. She listened, agreed when required, and all the while, behind her eyes, she was planning. The household settled into sleep near midnight. Lila waited in her room, still dressed, listening to the old house creak and sigh around her. When she finally heard her father snoring through the thin walls, she moved. She'd done this before, sneaking out to watch the stars or ride when the world felt too small and suffocating. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck, how to open the kitchen door without waking anyone. Within minutes she was outside, the cool night air a blessing after the stifling heat of the day. The stable was dark and familiar. Her mare, Sable, nickered softly as Lila approached, and she pressed her face against the animal's warm neck for a moment, breathing in the comforting smell of horse and hay. "One more ride, girl," she whispered. "One more ride before everything changes." The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to see by once her eyes adjusted. She didn't bother with a saddle, just slipped a bridle over Sable's head and led her quietly out of the barn. Only when they were well clear of the house did she mount, gathering the reins and pressing her heels gently into the mare's sides. The Boone Ranch lay 5 miles northeast, across rolling prairie that looked silver under the moonlight. Lila had ridden this route 100 times in daylight, knew every dip and rise of the land. Now in the darkness, it felt different, otherworldly and strange, as if she were riding through a dream, or toward one. Her heart hammered against her ribs, fear and exhilaration mixing until she couldn't tell them apart. What was she doing? Riding alone in the middle of the night to confess her feelings to a man who'd never given her any real reason to hope? It was madness, reckless and foolish, and completely unlike her usual careful self. But that careful self was about to be married off to pay her father's debts. That careful self had spent 7 years hoping someone else would make the first move, take the first risk, say the first true word. Where had it gotten her? Nowhere. The Boone place came into view as she crested the final ridge, a modest ranch house, smaller than her family's, with a barn and a few outbuildings scattered around it. A single light burned in one window. He was awake. Lila's courage almost failed her then. She pulled Sable to a halt, sitting there in the darkness, watching that distant light and trying to remember how to breathe. She could turn around, ride home, climb back into her room, and pretend this mad impulse had never seized her. Marry William Garrett and learn to live with the choice. People did it all the time, made practical decisions, sacrificed desire for security, survived. But surviving wasn't living, and somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she'd kept locked and guarded for 7 long years, something was screaming that if she turned back now, she'd regret it for the rest of her life. Lila pressed her heels to Sable's sides and rode down toward the house. The dog started barking before she was halfway across the yard, a big shepherd mix named Bear, who'd known her since he was a puppy. His barking was more greeting than alarm, but it served its purpose. The front door opened, and Caleb stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, his form backlit by the lamp behind him. "Who's there?" His voice was hard, alert. "It's me," Lila called out, and she heard the exact moment recognition hit. The slight exhale, the shift in his stance as tension turned to confusion. "Lila?" He lowered the rifle. "What are you doing here? Is something wrong?" "Everything," she thought. "Everything is wrong." "I need to talk to you," she said, dismounting. Her legs felt shaky beneath her, but she made herself walk forward, leading Sable toward the porch. Caleb set the rifle aside and came down the steps to meet her. Up close, she could see he was dressed in just trousers and an unbuttoned shirt, his feet bare, his dark hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. He looked tired and worried, and somehow more real than he ever had in town or church, stripped of all the careful distance he usually maintained. "Is someone hurt?" he asked, reaching for Sable's reins. "Your father—" "No one's hurt." Lila's voice came out steadier than she felt. I needed to see you." He stilled, his hand frozen halfway to the reins, his eyes searching her face in the moonlight. "It's after midnight, Lila." "I know." "Does your family know you're here?" "No." Something shifted in his expression, concern deepening into alarm. "You shouldn't be here. If anyone found out, tomorrow I'm signing a marriage contract with William Garrett." The words burst out of her, sharp and desperate. "The day after that, I'll be his wife. So tonight is all I have left, and I'm done being careful. I'm done pretending I don't feel what I feel." Caleb went very still. In the lamplight spilling from the house, she could see his jaw clench, see the muscle jump in his cheek. "Lila." "7 years," she said, her voice breaking. 7 years I've watched you, waited for you. Hoped that maybe, someday, you'd see me as more than just the girl you pulled from a creek. 7 years of wondering if I was imagining the way you looked at me sometimes, like I was something precious you couldn't touch. Tell me I imagined it. Tell me I'm a fool, and I'll ride home right now and marry William Garrett and never speak of this again. But if there's even a chance, if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, stop." His voice was rough, almost pained. "You can't say these things." "Why not? What's the point of silence now?" "Because you deserve better than this." The words exploded from him with startling force. "Better than a broken-down ranch that barely breaks even. Better than a man with more debts than prospects. Better than—" He gestured at himself, at the modest house behind him, at everything his life was and wasn't. "Better than me, Lila. You don't get to decide what I deserve. Your father does. And he's right to choose Garrett. The man can give you a real future, security, comfort, a life without—" "I don't want security!" The words rang out across the quiet yard, startling even herself with their vehemence. "I want a life that's mine. I want to wake up next to someone I actually chose. I want—" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I want you." The silence that followed was devastating. Caleb stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. She could see the war happening behind his eyes, could practically feel the weight of everything he wasn't saying. "You don't know what you're asking," he said finally. "Then tell me." "I'm asking you to throw away everything. Your family's approval, your father's good name, the comfortable life you were raised to expect. I'm asking you to choose poverty and struggle and a future with no guarantees. I'm asking you to bet everything on—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "On a man who has nothing to offer but calloused hands and a half-broken dream." Lila stepped closer, close enough to see the silver moonlight reflected in his dark eyes, close enough to smell leather and wood smoke and something uniquely him. "And what would I get in return?" she asked softly. His control cracked, just for a moment, but she saw it. Saw the careful walls he'd built come crashing down. Saw the naked want in his eyes, the longing he'd been hiding. "Everything I am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I have. Every morning and every night for the rest of our lives. It's not much, Lila, but it would be real." Her breath caught. "That's all I've ever wanted. Your father will disown you. I know. The town will talk. Let them. We'll struggle. There will be times when—" "Caleb." She reached up, laying her hand against his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palm. "Stop giving me reasons to say no, and give me one reason to say yes." He covered her hand with his touch warm and rough and achingly gentle. "I've loved you since the day I pulled you from that creek," he said. "Loved you through every Sunday service and every chance meeting in town. Loved you enough to stay away because I thought that's what you needed. But if you're telling me there's a chance, if you're saying you'd choose this life, choose me, then I'm done pretending I can live without you." The world seemed to stop. Everything, the chirping crickets, the rustling grass, the beating of her own heart, went silent in the wake of those words. "Then ask me," she whispered. "Ask you what?" "What you should have asked 7 years ago." Understanding dawned in his eyes. He took her other hand, holding both now, his grip strong and sure and slightly trembling. "Lila Carter," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "will you take a chance on me? Will you leave everything you know and build something new? Will you marry me, knowing it won't be easy, knowing I can't promise you anything but my whole heart and my best effort every single day?" Tears blurred her vision, but she was smiling, smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it." He pulled her close then, so fast and fierce she gasped, his arms coming around her like he'd never let go. She buried her face in his chest, breathing him in, feeling the solid reality of him after so many years of distance and wondering. "We'll have to leave," he said into her hair. "Tonight, before anyone knows, before your father can stop us." "I know. I have some money saved, not much, but enough to get us west. There's land opening up in the territories, hard land, but it's there for the taking. We could start over, build something that's ours." "When do we leave?" He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. "You're sure, really sure, because once we do this, there's no going back." She thought of her mother's tired face, her father's desperate relief at the Garrett arrangement, the life of quiet comfort she was supposed to want, the price tag of her future paid in someone else's currency. Then she thought of waking up every day next to this man, working beside him, building a life that belonged to them and no one else. Hard and uncertain and completely, terrifyingly real. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said. Caleb kissed her then, soft and careful at first, like she was something precious that might break. But when she kissed him back, rising on her toes and wrapping her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened into something more. 7 years of longing poured into a single perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Get your horse settled," he said. "I'll pack what we need. We'll ride north to the ridge, then cut west before dawn. By the time anyone realizes we're gone, we'll be too far ahead to catch." Will reality crash back in? What they were about to do, what it would mean, who they'd hurt. "My mother," Lila whispered. "She'll be devastated." "I know." His voice was gentle but firm. "But you can't live your life for her, or your father, or what the town expects. Sometimes you have to choose yourself, even when it breaks other people's hearts." She nodded, blinking back tears. Will you give me a minute to say goodbye?" He understood without her explaining. "Take what time you need. I'll be ready when you are." Lila walked back to Sable, her legs unsteady, her mind reeling. She should feel guilty, terrified, consumed with doubt. And part of her did. Part of her was screaming that this was madness, that she was throwing away everything for a future with no safety net. But underneath the fear was something stronger, something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump. Not because you knew you'd survive the fall, but because staying on solid ground meant dying slowly. She looked back at Caleb, standing on his porch watching her, lamplight painting him in shades of gold and shadow. This man who'd loved her in silence for 7 years, who'd stayed away because he thought it was best for her, who was willing to risk everything now because she'd asked him to. Her choice was made. She led Sable toward the barn, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and exhilaration. Behind her, she heard Caleb move back into the house, heard the sounds of him preparing for their escape. Tomorrow, her family would wake to find her gone. The town would explode with scandal. William Garrett would rage at being spurned. Her father's debts would remain unpaid. But she would be free, and standing at the beginning of everything she'd ever truly wanted, even with all its danger and uncertainty, Lila felt more alive than she had in 7 years of careful, fearful waiting. The barn was dark and warm, smelling of hay and animals. She found an empty stall for Sable, removed the bridle, and stood for a moment with her hand on the mare's neck, steadying herself. "This is crazy," she whispered to the horse. "Completely, utterly crazy." Sable huffed softly, unconcerned with human drama. "But it's my kind of crazy," Lila added, and smiled despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. When she emerged from the barn, Caleb was waiting in the yard with 2 horses saddled and a pack secured behind each saddle. He'd changed into riding clothes, boots, and a heavy coat. In the moonlight, he looked solid and capable and completely certain. "Ready?" he asked. She thought of everything she was leaving behind, everything she was choosing instead. "Ready," she said. He helped her mount, his hands steady on her waist, then swung up onto his own horse. For a moment, they sat there in the silver darkness, poised on the edge of a decision that would change everything. "Last chance to change your mind," Caleb said quietly. "I won't blame you if—" "Ride," Lila said, "before I lose my nerve." He grinned then, a flash of pure joy that transformed his usually serious face, and touched his heels to his horse's sides. They rode north into the darkness, leaving behind the life Lila was supposed to live and heading toward one she couldn't yet see. The night was cool and endless, the stars impossibly bright. Somewhere behind them, the world she knew was sleeping, unaware that by morning, everything would be different. Ahead lay only uncertainty, hard land and harder choices, poverty and struggle and no guarantee of success. But beside her rode a man who'd loved her through 7 years of silence, who'd chosen her when choosing her meant risking everything, who was willing to build a future from nothing but hope and determination and 2 willing hearts. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lila felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen, replaced by something that felt remarkably like freedom. The horses' hooves drummed a steady rhythm across the prairie. Behind them, the lights of Caleb's ranch disappeared into the darkness. Ahead, the horizon was just beginning to show the faintest hint of gray, the promise of dawn still hours away. They had a long ride ahead of them, a longer future to figure out. But for now, in this moment, racing through the night with the wind in her hair and hope burning bright in her chest, Lila Carter knew she'd made the only choice she could live with. Not the safe choice, not the expected choice, but hers. They rode through what remained of the night like fugitives fleeing a crime, which, in a sense, they were. The moon tracked their progress across the prairie, a silent witness to their escape. Lila's heart hadn't stopped racing since they'd left Caleb's ranch, adrenaline singing through her veins with every mile they put between themselves and the life she'd abandoned. "How far north before we turn west?" she called to Caleb, who rode slightly ahead, his eyes scanning the darkness with the practiced awareness of a man who'd spent his life reading land and weather. "Another hour," he called back. "There's a creek bed that runs west about 12 miles from here. We'll follow it. Harder to track us that way, and the horses will need water by dawn. The practicality of his answer steadied her. He'd thought this through, had a plan. This wasn't just wild impulse. It was calculated risk, which somehow made it feel less like madness and more like courage. The sky was beginning to pale when they reached the creek bed, a ribbon of darker shadow cutting through the rolling grassland. Caleb dismounted first, walking to the edge and listening. Lila could hear it too now, the faint trickle of water over stones. Not much, but enough. "We'll rest the horses here for a bit," Caleb said, helping her down. His hands lingered on her waist for a moment, and even through the exhaustion starting to creep into her bones, she felt the warmth of his touch. "Eat something. We've got hard riding ahead once the sun comes up." He pulled bread and dried meat from one of the saddlebags, along with a canteen. They sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, sharing the simple meal in the strange half-light of approaching dawn. The food was plain, but Lila had never tasted anything better, flavored as it was with freedom and choice and the impossible reality of what they'd done. "Tell me about this land we're heading for," she said, watching his profile as he stared out at the lightening horizon. "What makes you think we can build something there?" Caleb took a drink from the canteen before answering. "Met a man last year passing through on his way back east. Samuel Hutchins. He tried homesteading in the Dakota Territory, lasted 3 years before his wife got sick and they had to leave. He said the land was brutal, unforgiving. The winters could kill you and the summers could break you." He turned to look at her then, his eyes serious. "But he also said if you could survive it, if you could make it work, there was space enough to breathe. To build something that was truly yours. No banks breathing down your neck, no old debts following you. Just land and sky and whatever you could make of it." "And that's what you want?" Lila asked softly. "Space to breathe?" "I want to wake up every morning knowing that what I build is mine," he said. "Not mortgaged to someone else's vision of what my life should be. Not tied to decisions my father made before I was born. Just mine." He paused, then added, "Ours." The word sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. Ours. A future built together, owned by no one but themselves. "How long will it take us to get there?" she asked. "If we push hard and the weather holds? 3 weeks, maybe 4? We'll need to stop in settlements along the way to resupply. I've got enough money for basics, but we'll have to be careful." Lila thought of the small bag of coins she'd grabbed from her room before leaving, her savings from years of birthday gifts and small jobs around town. It wouldn't amount to much, but every bit would help. "We should move," Caleb said, standing and offering her his hand. "Want to cover as much ground as we can before the heat sets in." The sun broke over the horizon as they mounted up again, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Beautiful and terrible all at once, Lila thought, like everything they were doing. They followed the creek bed west, riding in comfortable silence for the most part, saving their energy for the miles ahead. But as the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm, reality began to settle in with uncomfortable weight. "They'll have found the note by now," Lila said, breaking the quiet. She'd left a letter on her pillow, brief and probably inadequate, trying to explain the unexplainable. "I'm sorry. I can't marry William Garrett. I've made my choice. Please don't look for me." The words had seemed hollow even as she wrote them, but what else could she say? "How did you apologize for choosing your own life?" "Your father will be furious," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "Beyond furious. The marriage contract, the debts, the arrangement with Garrett. I've destroyed all of it." She felt the guilt rise up, threatening to choke her. "He needed that money, Caleb. The ranch was already dying," Caleb said gently but firmly. "One good marriage wasn't going to save it. Your father's problems go back years. Bad investments, worse luck, and a refusal to adapt when the cattle market changed. You marrying Garrett would have bought him time, nothing more. You think he'll send someone after us?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering. Depends on how angry he is versus how practical he wants to be. Sending men after us costs money he doesn't have. And even if they caught us, what then? Drag you back to face a scandal that would make you unmarriageable anyway? Garrett certainly won't want you now. The words stung, even though she knew they were true. She'd made herself damaged goods in the eyes of respectable society. A woman who'd run off in the night with a man, unchaperoned, unmarried. Her reputation was ashes. "Do you regret it?" Caleb asked, watching her face. Already? No. The answer came without hesitation. I'm scared of what's coming, scared of what I've done to my family, scared of 100 things I can't control. But I don't regret choosing you. Something in his expression softened. Good, because I'm scared too. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. They rode on through the morning, the land opening up before them in endless rolling waves. Around midday, Caleb called a halt near a stand of cottonwood trees that offered blessed shade. The horses were lathered and tired, heads drooping as they drank from the creek. We'll rest here through the worst heat, Caleb said, loosening his horse's girth. Travel again when it cools down. Lila slid from Sable's back, her legs trembling with fatigue. She'd ridden plenty in her life, but never like this, hours on end with no break, pushing hard over rough ground. Every muscle ached. Caleb spread a blanket in the shade and gestured for her to sit. She collapsed onto it gratefully, leaning back against a tree trunk and closing her eyes. The exhaustion that had been building since they fled caught up with her all at once, dragging at her like an undertow. Sleep if you can, Caleb said, settling down beside her. I'll keep watch. You need rest too, she protested weakly. I'll sleep later. Right now, I need to make sure no one's following. Lila opened her eyes to look at him. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the horizon behind them, and she realized he was more worried about pursuit than he'd let on. You really think they'll come? I think your father is a proud man who just lost a lucrative marriage contract and his daughter in the same night, Caleb said carefully. Pride makes people do foolish things, so until we're far enough away that it doesn't make sense to chase us anymore, I'm going to assume someone's coming. The fear that had been lurking at the edges of Lila's consciousness crystallized into something sharp and immediate. She sat up straighter, scanning the empty prairie behind them. Nothing but grass and heat shimmer, but that didn't mean they were safe. If they catch us, she started, but couldn't finish the thought. They won't. Caleb's voice was steel. I won't let them. You can't fight off multiple men, Caleb. If my father sends ranch hands, if Garrett hires men, then we'll run faster, ride harder, take routes they won't expect. He turned to look at her, and the fierce determination in his eyes made her breath catch. I didn't ask you to leave everything just to let someone drag you back. Whatever it takes, Lila. We keep going. She believed him, believed in the set of his shoulders and the hard promise in his voice. But she also understood what he wasn't saying, that if it came down to it, if they were cornered, he would fight. Would put himself between her and whoever came. Would risk everything to keep the choice she'd made from being stolen away. Sleep, he said again, softer this time. I've got you. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could keep watch too, but exhaustion won. She let herself lean against him, felt his arm come around her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep. She dreamed of the creek where he'd saved her 7 years ago. But in the dream, the water kept rising, pulling her under no matter how hard she fought. She was drowning, gasping for air that wouldn't come, and somewhere above her she could hear her father's voice shouting about debts and duty and the price of disobedience. She woke with a gasp, disoriented and panicked. The sun had moved across the sky. She'd slept longer than she'd meant to. Caleb was still beside her, watching the horizon, his rifle across his lap. How long? She asked, her voice rough with sleep. Couple hours. How do you feel? Like I've been kicked by a horse. She stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her back and legs. But better than before. There's more food in the pack if you're hungry. We should eat before we ride again. They shared another simple meal, this time supplemented with some jerky and hardtack that tasted like salty cardboard but filled the hollow ache in Lila's stomach. As they ate, she found herself studying Caleb, really looking at him in the afternoon light. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, all hard angles and sun-darkened skin. Nothing like the polished gentleman who called on proper young ladies in town. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, his clothes worn but clean. He'd shaved that morning before they left, but stubble was already darkening his jaw again. This was the man she'd chosen. Not wealthy, not connected, not offering her an easy life. Just honest and brave and willing to build something from nothing. What are you thinking? He asked, catching her staring. That I don't know anything about you, she said. Not really. 7 years of watching from a distance, and I don't know your favorite color or what you dream about or what you're afraid of. He smiled slightly. We've got time to learn all that. 3 weeks on the trail, and then the rest of our lives. Tell me something now, something true. He considered for a moment, turning a piece of jerky over in his fingers. I'm afraid of failing you, he said finally. Of bringing you out to this new territory and not being able to make it work. Of you waking up one day and realizing you gave up everything for a man who couldn't deliver on his promises. The vulnerability in his voice made her chest ache. And what do you dream about? Land that's mine, a house I built with my own hands. Waking up next to you every morning and knowing that no one can take it away because we earned it. He looked at her then. What about you? What are you afraid of? That I'm not strong enough for this, she admitted. I've lived my whole life with a roof over my head and food on the table and people to fall back on. I don't know how to survive on nothing. You're stronger than you think. You rode out to my place in the middle of the night and told me you loved me. That took more courage than most people have in their whole lives. Or more stupidity. Sometimes they're the same thing. He stood, brushing crumbs from his pants. We should get moving. Want to cover another 10, 12 miles before we stop for the night. The afternoon riding was harder than the morning. The heat was oppressive, and despite their rest, both Lila and the horses were flagging. They walked more than they rode, saving the animals' strength. And by the time the sun started sinking toward the horizon, every step felt like a small victory. As twilight settled over the prairie, Caleb finally called a halt near an outcropping of rocks that would provide some shelter and concealment. They set up a simple camp. No fire, Caleb decided. Too risky. And ate cold food while the stars emerged overhead. Tell me about your mother, Caleb said as they sat together, backs against the rocks, watching the night sky. You never talk about her much. Lila was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer. She was beautiful once, she said finally. There are pictures of her from before she married my father. She looked happy then, alive. But marriage and the ranch and my father's failures wore her down. By the time I was old enough to notice, she was already disappearing, becoming smaller and quieter and more resigned. You think she regrets marrying him? I think she regrets giving up her choices. She came from money, could have married someone in the city, had a comfortable life, but she fell in love with a rancher and thought love would be enough. Lila pulled her knees up to her chest. It wasn't, and rather than leave, she just faded. Became a ghost in her own life. You won't fade, Caleb said quietly. I won't let you. How can you promise that? Because I'm not your father. I won't ask you to give up who you are. I won't let my pride or my failures grind you down. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. We're partners in this, Lila. Equal partners. Your voice matters as much as mine. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this would be different, that they would be different, but her mother had probably believed the same thing once. Promise me something, she said. Anything. If I start to disappear, if you see me becoming someone smaller and quieter and less than who I am, you'll tell me. You won't just let it happen. He squeezed her hand. I promise. And you promise me the same thing. If you see me becoming like your father, bitter and desperate and willing to sacrifice others for my own survival, you'll call me on it. Deal. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands linked, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled and the horses stirred restlessly. We should sleep, Caleb said eventually. I want to be riding again before dawn. They made their bed on the hard ground, sharing a single blanket for warmth against the cooling night. Lila lay on her back, acutely aware of Caleb beside her, the solid warmth of him just inches away. They weren't married yet, hadn't even kissed since that one desperate moment in his yard. The propriety that had been drilled into her since childhood whispered that this was wrong, that she should maintain distance, that a respectable woman wouldn't. She rolled onto her side, facing him. In the starlight, she could just make out the line of his profile. Caleb? Yeah? I'm glad it's you. He turned his head to look at her, and even in the darkness, she could see the warmth in his eyes. Me too, he said. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. But as she closed her eyes, she felt his hand find hers beneath the blanket, their fingers interlacing once more. And somehow, lying on the hard ground in the middle of nowhere with nothing but stars above and uncertainty ahead, Lila felt safer than she had in her entire life. She woke before dawn to find Caleb already up, checking the horses and scanning the horizon. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the world in shades of gray and purple. "Anything?" she asked, pushing herself up from the blanket. "No, but I want to move anyway. The farther we get, the better I'll feel." They ate quickly. More hardtack and jerky, washed down with water from the canteen, and were riding again as the sun crept above the horizon. The second day on the trail was somehow harder than the first. The novelty had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of mile after mile of empty prairie. Lila's body ached in places she hadn't known could ache, and despite the vastness of the landscape, she felt claustrophobic with fear. Every distant dust cloud made her heart race. Every sound that wasn't birdsong or wind through grass set her nerves jangling. She kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see riders bearing down on them, her father's face twisted with rage. William Garrett's hired guns with ropes and guns and hard justice. "You're going to give yourself a sick headache looking back like that," Caleb observed around midday. "Eyes forward, Lila. What's behind us doesn't matter anymore." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who—" She stopped, but the damage was done. Caleb's expression hardened. "Who what?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Who ran away? Last I checked, we both left everything behind. Or do you think I had nothing to lose?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Lila took a breath, trying to organize thoughts that were tangled with exhaustion and fear. I'm the one they'll blame. I'm the one who broke the contract, who destroyed my father's plans. You're just what? The man who corrupted you? Who seduced an innocent girl away from her rightful place?" His laugh was bitter. "Trust me, Lila, they'll find plenty of blame for both of us. The only difference is I don't care what they think anymore." "Well, maybe I do." The words burst out of her, sharp and raw. "Maybe I care that my mother is probably crying herself sick right now. Maybe I care that my father's dreams just died because his daughter was too selfish to sacrifice herself for the family. Maybe I care that I'm going to be remembered as the girl who—" "Stop." Caleb reined his horse to a halt, and Lila did the same. They sat there in the middle of the vast prairie, facing each other, both breathing hard. "Listen to me. You can care about what they think, and you can feel guilty about the pain you've caused, but you cannot let it pull you back, because that's what guilt does. It hooks into you and drags you back to the place you escaped from. And once you're back, it doesn't matter how much it hurt or how wrong it was, you'll be stuck there forever. So I'm just supposed to not feel anything about what I've done? No, feel it, grieve it, but don't let it change your mind, because the only thing worse than leaving would be going back." His eyes burned into hers. "Do you want to go back, Lila? Do you want to turn around and marry William Garrett and spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been?" "No." The answer came immediately, visceral. "No, I don't." Then eyes forward. "Whatever's behind us is done. We can't change it. All we can do is keep writing." She nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. He was right. She knew he was right, but knowing it and feeling it were two different things. They rode on in tense silence for the next hour, the unspoken tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Finally, as they stopped to water the horses at another small creek, Lila couldn't take it anymore. "I'm sorry," she said as Caleb was filling the canteens, "for what I said before. You're right. We're both in this. I'm scared and tired and taking it out on you." He looked at her for a long moment, then his expression softened. "I know, and I'm sorry for snapping at you. This is hard. It's supposed to be hard. We're going to fight sometimes. That's what happens when two people are trying to figure out how to be together." "Is this a fight?" she asked. "Because if it is, it's our first one." "Yeah, I suppose it is." He smiled slightly. "How do you think we did?" "Terrible. We're awful at it." "Guess we'll have to practice." The absurdity of the statement made her laugh, and just like that, the tension broke. Caleb crossed to where she stood and pulled her into his arms, and she leaned into him, breathing in the smell of leather and sweat and the unique scent that was just him. "We're going to be okay," he murmured into her hair. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but we will." "Promise?" "I promise to try. That's all I can give you." "It's enough," she said, and meant it. They made better time that afternoon, perhaps because the fight had cleared the air, or perhaps because they were simply getting better at the rhythm of constant travel. As the sun began its descent, Caleb pointed to a dark line on the horizon. "Trees," he said, "probably marks a decent water source. We'll camp there tonight." The tree line turned out to be a small river, not much more than a wide stream really, but enough to provide fresh water and shade. They set up camp in a clearing and, for the first time since fleeing, Caleb deemed it safe enough for a small fire. "We're far enough out now," he explained as he built a careful circle of stones. "And we haven't seen any sign of pursuit. I think we might have actually made it." The relief that flooded through Lila was almost dizzying. "You mean no one's coming?" "I mean, if they were, they'd have caught us by now. We've been pushing hard, but experienced riders on fresh horses could have overtaken us if they'd left right away. The fact that we haven't seen anyone suggests either they're not chasing or they gave up when they realized how far ahead we were." Lila sank down onto a fallen log, the weight of 2 days of constant fear suddenly lifting. "We're really free. Free of pursuit, anyway. Still got a long road ahead of us and plenty of other dangers. But yeah, I think we can breathe a little easier." That night they ate hot food for the first time since leaving, just beans and bacon cooked over the fire, but it tasted like a feast. They talked as they ate, small conversations about nothing important, learning each other in ways they'd never had the chance to before. She discovered he'd taught himself to read from old newspapers his father had used for insulation, that his mother had died when he was 12, and he still missed her every day, that he'd once wanted to be a school teacher but couldn't afford the training. He learned that she'd always been afraid of thunderstorms but pretended not to be, that she could draw beautifully but never showed anyone her sketches, that she'd read every book in her father's library 3 times over and still hungered for more stories. "What's your favorite?" he asked. "Book, I mean." She thought about it. "There's this collection of poems by Walt Whitman that I found hidden behind the other books. I think my mother must have hidden it there because she thought it was inappropriate." She smiled. "It probably is, but there's this one line I always come back to. I am large, I contain multitudes." "Why that one?" "Because it feels true. Like we're all carrying so many different versions of ourselves, so many different possibilities. And maybe we're not supposed to pick just one. Maybe we're supposed to be all of them at once, scared and brave, proper and wild, careful and reckless." Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I like that," he said finally. "Makes it seem less like we have to have everything figured out." "Do you think we're crazy?" Lila asked, "for doing this?" "Probably. But maybe the best things in life require a little craziness." As the fire burned down to embers and the stars emerged overhead, they sat close together, shoulders touching, both staring into the fading flames. Tomorrow they would ride on, deeper into unknown territory, closer to the future they'd chosen. But tonight, in this moment, they were simply 2 people who'd taken a leap of faith and were still, miraculously, falling together. "Lila?" Caleb's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes? Thank you for choosing this, for choosing me." She turned to look at him, seeing the firelight reflected in his eyes, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Something like certainty, like peace. "Thank you for being worth choosing," she said. He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and for the first time since they'd fled into the night, Lila felt like they might actually make it. Like the impossible thing they were attempting might just be possible after all. When they finally banked the fire and lay down to sleep, she curled against his side, his arm around her, and fell asleep to the sound of his heartbeat and the soft whisper of the river nearby. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had made it through their first real fight, their first real fears, and come out the other side still together. It was a start. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely liberating. They woke before dawn, rode until the heat became unbearable, rested in whatever shade they could find, then rode again until darkness forced them to stop. The landscape changed gradually as they pushed west, the rolling prairie giving way to rougher terrain scattered with more rocks and scrub brush, the grass growing shorter and tougher. On the 5th day, they reached their first settlement, a collection of ramshackle buildings that could barely be called a town. A trading post, a blacksmith, a saloon, and maybe a dozen houses scattered around a dusty main street. Caleb insisted they stop only long enough to resupply and get the horses reshod. Keep your head down, he told Lila as they rode in. Let me do the talking. The trading post was dim and cramped, smelling of tobacco and old leather. The man behind the counter looked them over with sharp, calculating eyes as Caleb listed what they needed: flour, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, ammunition. That's a fair bit of supplies, the man observed. You folks headed far? Far enough, Caleb said evenly, counting out coins. The man's gaze slid to Lila, who stood near the door trying to look invisible. Your wife? Caleb didn't hesitate. Yes. Awful young to be dragging out into the territories. She's tougher than she looks. Caleb's tone made it clear the conversation was over. He gathered the supplies and steered Lila out of the store before the man could ask anything else. That was close, Lila whispered as they loaded the packs onto the horses. He was just nosy, not suspicious. But we need to be careful. Small towns like this, people talk. And if anyone's asking questions about a runaway girl and the man she left with, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They mounted up and rode out of town without looking back, not stopping again until they were well clear of any prying eyes. That night, camped beside a dry creek bed under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet, Caleb brought up something that had clearly been weighing on his mind. We need to get married, he said without preamble. Properly married, I mean. With a witness and a record. Lila looked up from the fire where she'd been watching the flames dance. I thought we were going to wait until we reached the territory. That was before I realized how many questions people ask. If we're traveling as husband and wife, we need to actually be husband and wife. Otherwise, every town we pass through is going to be a risk. And you think getting married will make us safer? I think it gives us legitimacy. A marriage certificate is proof we're not just some couple running from the law or someone's angry family. It makes us respectable, or at least respectable enough that people will leave us alone. Lila considered this, staring into the fire. The practical part of her brain knew he was right. But another part, the part that had imagined this moment since she was a girl, felt a pang of disappointment. This wasn't how she'd pictured getting married. No church, no family, no celebration. Just a piece of paper and cold practicality. Hey, Caleb said softly, moving to sit beside her. I know this isn't what you dreamed of. If I could give you something better, it's not that, she interrupted. Or not just that. It's just, getting married feels like it should be about love, not survival tactics. Who says it can't be both? He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. I want to marry you, Lila. Not just because it's practical, though it is. I want to marry you because I love you, because I want to stand in front of someone and make promises to you that I intend to keep for the rest of my life. The circumstances aren't perfect, but the feeling is real. She turned to face him, searching his eyes in the firelight. You really mean that? Every word. So what do you say? Will you marry me? Again, I guess, since you already said yes once, but this time for real. With witnesses and paperwork and everything legal? A smile tugged at her lips, despite the strangeness of the situation. You really know how to sweep a girl off her feet, Caleb Boone. Is that a yes? That's a yes. He grinned and pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. There's a town called Redemption about 3 days west of here, he said. Should be big enough to have someone who can officiate. We'll do it there. Redemption. The name felt almost too perfect, too symbolic. But Lila didn't say that. Instead, she nodded and let herself lean into Caleb's warmth, watching the fire burn down to embers while the vast darkness of the prairie stretched around them. They reached Redemption on a scorching afternoon when the sun felt like a physical weight pressing down from above. It was bigger than the first settlement they'd passed through, a proper town with a church, a hotel, a bank, and several blocks of businesses. Civilization, or at least a rough approximation of it. We'll get a room at the hotel, Caleb said, eyeing the dusty street. Clean up, rest for a day, then find whoever can marry us. The hotel clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, looked relieved to have customers. Haven't seen many travelers lately, she said as she handed Caleb a key. Most folks are too scared of the Indian troubles to venture out this way. Indian troubles? Lila asked, alarm sparking through her. Oh, nothing to worry about in town, dear. But further west, there's been some conflicts over land rights. Just be careful if you're heading into the territories. Caleb thanked her and led Lila upstairs to a small but clean room with a real bed and a wash basin. After days of sleeping on the ground, the simple furnishings looked like luxury. I'll go find the minister, Caleb said, setting down their bags. You should rest. Maybe take a bath if the hotel has one. What will you tell him about us? The truth. That we're heading west to Homestead and want to be married before we go. He paused. Unless you want to make up a story. No, Lila said firmly. No more lies. Just maybe don't mention the part about running away. He smiled. I think I can manage that. After he left, Lila did exactly as he'd suggested, paid the hotel woman an extra $1 for a bath, and spent a glorious hour soaking in hot water, scrubbing away days of trail dust. When she emerged, clean and dressed in the one good dress she'd brought, she barely recognized herself in the small mirror. She looked older somehow, leaner. There was something different in her eyes, something harder and more determined than the girl who'd left home less than a week ago. Caleb returned as she was braiding her damp hair, his expression troubled. What's wrong? She asked immediately. Nothing's wrong, exactly. I found the minister. Reverend Hutchins, nice enough man. He's willing to marry us tomorrow afternoon. He paused. But he asked if your family knew, if they approved. Lila's stomach clenched. What did you tell him? I told him we were of age and didn't need permission, which is true. You're 22, I'm 29. Legally, we're allowed to make our own choices. He crossed to where she stood, taking her hands. But he was clearly uncomfortable, asked if there was any reason we were in such a hurry. I think he suspects we're running from something. Did he refuse to marry us? No, but he wants to meet with both of us tomorrow morning. Talk to us separately. Make sure we know what we're doing. Caleb's jaw tightened. Make sure I'm not forcing you into anything, I expect. Lila felt a flash of anger. He thinks you're… what? Kidnapping me? Coercing me? He thinks I'm a man traveling with a young woman who seems anxious to get married quickly and quietly. Can you blame him for being cautious? She couldn't, really. In the Reverend's position, she might wonder the same things. So what do? We tell him the truth, that you left home willingly, that we love each other and want to build a life together, that we're not running from the law or from violence, we're running towards something better. And if he doesn't believe us, then we find someone else who will. Caleb cupped her face gently. One way or another, Lila, we're getting married tomorrow. I promise you that. They spent the rest of the day wandering the town, both restless with anticipation and nerves. They ate dinner at a small restaurant, the first real meal they'd had in days that wasn't cooked over a campfire, and returned to their hotel room as the sun was setting. The reality of sharing a room with one bed, suddenly felt overwhelming. They'd been sleeping side by side for days on the trail, but that had been different, out of necessity, survival. This felt like a choice, like crossing a line they'd been carefully avoiding. I can sleep on the floor, Caleb offered, reading her nervousness. Don't be ridiculous. We're getting married tomorrow. I think we can share a bed for one night. You sure? She wasn't, not entirely, but she nodded anyway, and they prepared for sleep with careful politeness, each giving the other privacy to change. When they finally lay down, both fully clothed and maintaining a careful space between them, the tension was almost unbearable. Caleb? Lila whispered into the darkness. Yeah? Are you scared? About tomorrow? He was quiet for a moment. Terrified, he admitted. Not about marrying you, about everything that comes after, about trying to build a life in a place I've never seen, with resources we barely have, and hoping I'm strong enough to make it work. What if we fail? Then we fail together, but at least we tried. At least we chose something real instead of settling for what other people wanted for us. Lila rolled onto her side, facing him in the darkness. I keep thinking about my mother, about how she chose love once and how it turned out for her. You're not your mother, Caleb said firmly, and I'm not your father. We get to write our own story. Promise me something, anything. Promise me that if it gets hard, when it gets hard, we'll fight for it, for us, that we won't just let it slip away. He reached across the space between them, finding her hand in the darkness. I promise. Now try to sleep. Tomorrow's a big day. But sleep was elusive. Lila lay awake for hours, listening to Caleb's breathing, eventually even out into sleep, her mind racing with everything that was about to happen. Tomorrow she would become a wife. Not to William Garrett with his cold eyes and colder calculations, but to Caleb Boone, the man who'd saved her life twice, once from drowning and once from a future that would have slowly suffocated her. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. They dressed in silence, the weight of the coming day making casual conversation impossible. At 9 o'clock, they presented themselves at the small church at the edge of town. Reverend Hutchins was a tall, thin man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of things. He welcomed them warmly but seriously and asked to speak with each of them alone. Caleb went first, disappearing into the Reverend's office while Lila waited in the church sanctuary, her palms sweating despite the cool morning air. When Caleb emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was unreadable. "Your turn," he said quietly. "Just be honest." The Reverend's office was small and neat, lined with books and smelling of old paper and lemon oil. He gestured for Lila to sit in a worn leather chair across from his desk. "Miss Carter," he began gently, "I want you to know that anything you tell me in this room stays between us. If you're in trouble, if you need help—" "I'm not in trouble," Lila interrupted. "Not the kind you're thinking of." "Then what kind are you in?" She took a breath and told him everything. About her father's debts, about the arranged marriage to William Garrett, about loving Caleb for 7 years and finally finding the courage to choose her own path. She didn't cry, didn't plead. She just laid out the facts and let him make of them what he would. When she finished, the Reverend was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those penetrating eyes. "You understand what you're giving up," he said finally. "Not a question." "Yes. And you're certain this is what you want. Not what Mr. Boone wants, not what circumstances are forcing you toward, but what you truly want." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Your family will be hurt by this. Your father especially. I know, and I wish there was a way to spare them that pain, but staying would have killed something essential in me. I would have survived, maybe even seemed happy eventually, but I would have been dead inside." Strong words. True words. Reverend Hutchins nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said, "and I'll marry you this afternoon. But I want you to understand something, Miss Carter. Marriage is not an escape. It's a commitment. And the life you're choosing, homesteading in the territories, is brutally hard. Many don't survive it. Those who do are changed by it, not always for the better." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because I've seen too many young couples head west full of dreams and optimism, only to limp back east broken and bitter a few years later. If you're doing this just to get away from your father's plans—" "I'm not," Lila said firmly. "I'm doing this because I love Caleb Boone, because I believe in what we can build together, because I'd rather struggle towards something real than live comfortably in a lie." The Reverend's stern expression softened slightly. "Then I'll see you both at 2 o'clock, and may you find what you're looking for out there in the wilderness." Lila left the office feeling lighter, the Reverend's approval, or at least his acceptance, lifting a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. Caleb was waiting outside, leaning against the church wall. "Well?" he asked. 2 o'clock, she said, smiling. "We're getting married at 2 o'clock." The hours until the ceremony felt both endless and impossibly short. They returned to the hotel to change, Caleb into his only good shirt and jacket, Lila into her dress, which she'd carefully pressed that morning. She wished for flowers, for music, for all the small ceremonies that usually accompanied a wedding. But when she looked at herself in the mirror, she realized she didn't need them. This wasn't about performance or appearances. It was about a choice, a promise, a leap into the unknown. They walked to the church together, through the dusty streets of redemption, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. A few townspeople watched them pass with curious eyes, but no one stopped them or asked questions. Reverend Hutchins was waiting in the sanctuary along with 2 witnesses he'd recruited, the hotel clerk who'd been kind to them, and the town's elderly doctor, a man with white whiskers and twinkling eyes who looked like he'd seen everything life could throw at a person and found it all vaguely amusing. "Well then," the Reverend said as they assembled before the simple altar, "shall we begin?" The ceremony was brief and straightforward, none of the elaborate ritual Lila had seen at weddings back home. just the essential words, the binding promises. The Reverend asked the required questions, and they answered, firmly, clearly, without hesitation. Do you, Caleb Boone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? I do. Caleb's voice was steady, his eyes never leaving Lila's face. And do you, Lila Carter, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? This was it, the moment of irrevocable choice. Once she said these words, there was no going back. She would be married to Caleb Boone, bound to him legally and morally, her future inextricably tied to his. She thought of her mother, fading slowly in her loveless marriage, thought of William Garrett and the life of comfortable imprisonment he'd represented, thought of all the safe, sensible choices she could have made. Then she looked at Caleb, at the man who'd loved her quietly for 7 years, who'd been willing to let her go if it meant she'd be safe, who was now standing here promising her everything he had, even though it wasn't much. I do, she said, her voice ringing clear through the small church. Caleb produced a simple gold band from his pocket. Where he'd gotten it, she didn't know, but it fit perfectly when he slid it onto her finger. They had no ring for him, but he didn't seem to care. By the power vested in me, Reverend Hutchins said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Caleb stepped closer, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness, and kissed her as their witnesses applauded. It was different from their other kisses, deeper, more certain, weighted with promise and permanence. When they broke apart, Lila felt tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't say if they were from joy or fear or the overwhelming realization of what they'd just done. They signed the marriage certificate with shaking hands, the witnesses adding their signatures below. Reverend Hutchins rolled the document carefully and handed it to Caleb. Guard this well, he said. You'll need it to prove your claim when you file for land, and may the road ahead be kinder than you expect. Outside the church, the late afternoon sun painted everything gold. Lila stood on the steps holding Caleb's arm, her husband's arm, and tried to absorb the reality of it all. Mrs. Boone, Caleb said, testing the name. That's me, she said, still not quite believing it. Lila Boone. How does it feel? Strange. Wonderful. Terrifying. She looked up at him. Real. They had dinner that night at the same restaurant, but everything felt different now. They weren't just two people fleeing toward an uncertain future. They were married. A unit. Whatever came next, they would face it together, bound not just by love, but by law. Back in their hotel room, the reality of their wedding night settled over them with awkward intensity. They'd been careful about physical boundaries on the trail, both understanding without discussing it that there were lines they shouldn't cross before marriage. But now those boundaries were gone, and neither quite knew how to navigate the new territory. I should probably tell you, Caleb said, standing by the window and looking out at the darkening street, I don't exactly have a lot of experience with this part of marriage. Neither do I, Lila admitted. Obviously. He turned to face her, nervous but honest. So we'll figure it out together? Together, she agreed. What happened next was tender and awkward, and nothing like the clinical description she'd overheard from married women or the romantic notions from novels. It was real and human and occasionally clumsy, but underneath it all was a genuine caring, a desire not just to claim but to cherish. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Caleb pressed a kiss to her forehead. You okay? He asked softly. Better than okay, she said, surprised to find it was true. I feel like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. No regrets? Not a single one. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for the first time since leaving home, Lila's dreams were peaceful. They stayed in redemption 2 more days, resting and resupplying before the final push west. The town began to feel almost comfortable, and Lila caught herself thinking about what it might be like to stay, to build a life here where there was already civilization and safety. But on the morning of the 3rd day, as they prepared to leave, Caleb laid out a map on the bed and pointed to a region marked in the Northwestern Territories. This is where we're heading, he said. It's rough country, but the land office is giving out 160-acre parcels to anyone willing to file a claim and work it. We prove it up over 5 years, build a dwelling, cultivate the land, make improvements, and it's ours, free and clear. 160 acres, Lila breathed. That's more than my father ever had. It's more than most people will ever have. But it's hard won, Lila. The kind of hard that breaks people. He looked at her seriously. We can still change our minds, stay here in redemption, find work, build a life in town. It would be easier. She studied the map, tracing the route they'd take with one finger. Easier, yes. Safer, certainly, but also smaller. Limited. Someone else's vision of what life should be. No, she said firmly. We didn't come this far to settle for easy. Let's go claim our land. They rode out of redemption as the sun cleared the horizon, heading northwest into country that grew progressively wilder with each mile. The settlements grew farther apart, the land more rugged. They saw fewer people and more wildlife, antelope that watched them pass with liquid eyes, hawks circling high overhead, once a bear in the distance that made both horses nervous. At night they camped under stars so thick and bright it looked like you could reach up and touch them. Caleb taught her to read the constellations, to find north by the stars, to predict weather by the color of the sunset. They talked for hours about the life they would build, what crops they might grow, what animals they'd raise, how they'd design their house. I want windows, Lila said one night. Big ones. I don't want to live in the dark. Windows it is, Caleb agreed. Anything else? A porch. Somewhere to sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down. I can do that. 2 weeks after leaving Redemption, they crested a ridge and saw the land office settlement spread below them, a cluster of tents and temporary structures surrounding a more permanent building where claims were filed. Beyond it, stretching to the horizon, was unclaimed territory, wild, vast, and waiting. There it is, Caleb said quietly, our future. Lila stared at the endless expanse of grassland and scattered trees, at the mountains visible in the far distance, at the sheer overwhelming possibility of it all. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Let's go claim it, she said. They rode down into the settlement as the afternoon light turned golden. Tomorrow they would file their claim, stake out their land, begin the hard work of building something from nothing. Tonight they would sleep one last night as travelers, poised on the edge of transformation. As they made camp on the outskirts of the settlement, Lila looked at the marriage certificate Caleb kept carefully protected in his saddlebag. Mrs. Lila Boone, it read. Married to Caleb Boone. Legal and binding. She'd left home as Lila Carter, uncertain and afraid. She'd become Lila Boone somewhere on the road between then and now, and tomorrow she would become a landowner, a homesteader, a woman building her own future with her own hands. The journey had been hard. The destination was uncertain. But as she sat beside her husband watching the stars emerge one by one above their future home, Lila felt something she'd never experienced in her father's house despite all its comforts. She felt free. The land office opened at dawn, and Caleb was waiting at the door before the clerk had even lit the lamps inside. Lila stood beside him, their marriage certificate clutched in her hands, both of them tired from a restless night of anticipation. Around them, other hopeful settlers gathered, men mostly, a few families, all with the same hungry look in their eyes. The look of people betting everything on a dream. The clerk was a harried-looking man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He processed claims with mechanical efficiency, barely looking up as he stamped documents and collected filing fees. Name, he asked when Caleb and Lila finally reached the front of the line. Caleb and Lila Boone, Caleb said, sliding their marriage certificate across the desk. The clerk examined it briefly, noted something in his ledger, then pulled out a large map covered in grid lines. Some sections were already marked with X's, claimed land. You're looking at the northwest quarter, I assume? That's where most of the unclaimed parcels are. Fair warning, there's a reason they're still available. Rough country, rocky soil, limited water sources in some areas. We'll take our chances, Caleb said. The clerk shrugged and rotated the map so they could see it better. Pick your section. 160 acres. You've got 5 years to prove it up. Build a dwelling at least 12 by 14 feet, cultivate at least 10 acres, live on the land for at least 6 months of each year. Meet those requirements, and the land's yours free and clear. Lila studied the map, trying to make sense of the grid system and terrain markings. Caleb pointed to a section that bordered a small creek tucked against a line of hills. "This one," he said. "Water access and some protection from the wind." "Section 14, Township 8 North," the clerk read. "That'll be $18 for the filing fee." Caleb counted out the money carefully, a significant chunk of their remaining funds. The clerk stamped their documents, made several notations in his ledger, and handed them a copy of their claim. "Congratulations," he said without enthusiasm. "You're now the proud owners of Section 14, or you will be in 5 years assuming you survive that long. Next." Outside, Lila looked at the document in her hands, at their names written in official ink, at the description of land that was now theirs to prove. "We actually did it," she whispered. "We did," Caleb confirmed, but his expression was already shifting from triumph to grim determination. Now comes the hard part. They spent 2 days at the settlement, using the last of their money to buy essential supplies: tools, seeds, a few chickens in a crate, nails, rope, canvas for temporary shelter. Every purchase was calculated and debated. Did they need an extra axe or more seed potatoes? Could they afford lamp oil, or should they rely on firelight? An older settler named Marcus, weathered and missing 2 fingers on his left hand, watched them loading their supplies and shook his head. "First-timers," he said, not unkindly. "I can always tell." "That obvious?" Caleb asked. "You've got that look, like you think determination and hard work will be enough." Marcus spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "They help, don't get me wrong, but this land doesn't care how hard you work. It'll take everything you've got and ask for more." "You still here, though," Lila observed, "so it can't be impossible." Marcus laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. "Impossible? No. But I've buried 2 neighbors in the last year. One froze to death in a blizzard trying to reach his barn. The other just gave up, stopped eating, stopped working, just laid down one day and didn't get back up. His wife found him 3 days later." "Why are you telling us this?" Lila asked, feeling ice form in her stomach. "Because you should know what you're up against. This isn't like farming back east where if you fail, you can sell the land and move to town. Out here, failure means death. Starvation, freezing, disease, accidents, take your pick." He looked them both over carefully. "You two seem decent enough. I'd hate to add you to the count of folks who didn't make it." Caleb squared his shoulders. "We appreciate the warning, but we're not planning to fail." "Nobody plans to," Marcus said. "But I'll give you one piece of real advice. When winter comes, and it will come harder than anything you've experienced back in Texas, don't be too proud to ask for help. The settlers out here, we look after each other because we have to. Pride will kill you faster than cold or hunger." "We'll remember that," Lila said quietly. They rode out the next morning, following the crude map the clerk had given them to locate their section. The land grew progressively wilder as they traveled, the signs of human habitation falling away until they were alone with just grass and sky and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. It took them most of the day to find Section 14. The creek was there, just as marked on the map, a thin ribbon of water cutting through prairie grass. The hills rose to the north, offering some shelter from that direction. The land itself was rough, not the gentle rolling prairie near Lila's family home, but harder country, rocky in places, with tough grass and scrub brush. "Well," Caleb said, surveying their 160 acres, "this is home." Home. The word felt both perfect and absurd. There was nothing here. No house, no barn, no fences, just raw land and possibility. "Where do we start?" Lila asked. "Shelter," Caleb said immediately. "We need somewhere to sleep before we do anything else. Then a well, or at least a reliable water source. Then we start breaking ground for planting." The first week was a blur of backbreaking labor. Caleb cut cottonwood poles while Lila gathered stones from the creek bed for a fire pit. They erected a temporary shelter using the canvas they'd bought, staking it against the hillside for protection from the wind. It was crude and offered little comfort, but it kept the rain off when storms rolled through. Water was their first real challenge. The creek flowed well enough now in late summer, but Caleb worried about winter and spring floods. They needed a well. He spent 3 days digging, his hands blistering and then bleeding as he worked through rocky soil. Lila helped when she could, hauling dirt and rocks, but mostly she focused on setting up their camp, organizing supplies, establishing a cooking area, trying to create some semblance of order in the chaos. On the fourth day, Caleb hit water at about 15 feet. The relief on his face when he climbed out of the hole, muddy and exhausted, was palpable. "We've got water," he said, and Lila heard the weight of that statement. Water meant survival. Water meant they had a chance. The next challenge was breaking ground for their first crop. The prairie sod was thick and tough, roots woven together like iron mesh. Caleb hitched their horse to a plow he'd bought third hand and spent days cutting furrows in the resistant earth. It was brutal work, and Lila watched him come back to camp each evening more exhausted than the day before. His shoulders bowed, his hands raw. She tried to help, but the plow was too heavy for her to control, the horse too strong. Instead, she followed behind him, breaking up the larger chunks of sod with a hoe, preparing the ground for planting. Her hands developed blisters that burst and bled, then formed calluses. Her back ached constantly. Her skin burned and then darkened under the relentless sun. "We're planting too late in the season," Caleb said one evening, worry etched in his face. "Even if everything goes perfectly, we'll barely have time for the crops to mature before frost." "Then we make it work," Lila said, though she had no idea how. "What choice do we have?" They planted potatoes, turnips, and winter wheat, hardy crops that might survive an early frost. The chickens they'd bought began laying eggs, a small blessing that meant protein they didn't have to hunt for. Caleb shot a deer and they spent 2 days preserving the meat, knowing they couldn't afford to waste a single ounce. The work was endless. Every day brought new challenges, new problems to solve. The canvas shelter leaked during heavy rains. One of the chickens was taken by a fox, and they had to build a better enclosure. The well needed to be lined with stones to prevent collapse. And always, there was more ground to break, more wood to cut, more preparations to make before winter arrived. A month after claiming their land, Lila looked at herself in the small hand mirror she'd brought from home and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin darkened by sun and wind. Her hands were rough and scarred. Her hair, once carefully maintained, was now cut shorter for practicality and constantly escaping from the braid she tied it in. "You're beautiful," Caleb said, coming up behind her and seeing her expression. "I look half-starved and completely exhausted," Lila said. "You look strong, like a woman who's building her own future." He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I'm proud of you, of how hard you're working. I know this isn't what you imagined when you agreed to marry me." "It's harder," Lila admitted, "so much harder than I thought it would be, but I still don't regret it." "Even when your hands are bleeding and we're eating beans for the third night in a row?" "Even then." She turned to face him. "How are you holding up?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was always so focused on solving problems, on keeping them alive and moving forward, that he rarely acknowledged his own struggle. "I'm scared," he said finally. "Terrified that I've brought you out here to suffer, that I've promised you something I can't deliver." "We promised each other," Lila corrected. "This isn't just on you, Caleb. We're in this together." "I know. But if something happens to you, if you get sick or hurt because of choices I made—" "Stop," she said firmly. "I made my own choices. I'm here because I want to be. And yes, it's hard, and yes, I'm scared too, but we're going to make this work." She said it with more confidence than she felt, but sometimes confidence was a choice, not a feeling. As summer turned to fall, their small crop began to show promise. The potato plants were healthy, the turnips growing, the wheat sprouted in neat rows, green and hopeful. They celebrated these small victories because they had to. Each growing plant was a vindication of their choice, proof that they could coax life from this hard land. But fall also brought their first real crisis. Lila woke one morning feeling dizzy and nauseous. She attributed it to exhaustion and poor diet, but when the feeling persisted for 3 days, accompanied by waves of dizziness so severe she couldn't stand, Caleb's concern turned to alarm. "You need to see a doctor," he said, watching her lean over the fire pit, too sick to eat. "The nearest doctor is 2 days' ride back at the settlement," Lila said. "We can't afford to lose that time. The harvest? To hell with the harvest if you're dying." "I'm not dying. I'm just—" She paused, a thought occurring to her that should have been obvious days ago. She counted back in her head, calculating dates. Her monthly courses, which had been regular as clockwork her entire adult life, were late, very late. Lila? Caleb was kneeling beside her now, his face pale with worry. What is it? I think I might be pregnant, she whispered. The words hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying. A baby. Here, in their canvas shelter with winter coming and barely enough food for two, let alone three. Caleb's expression went through a series of rapid transformations: shock, fear, wonder, and finally determination. You're sure? No, but it would explain the sickness and the dizziness and... She trailed off, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. When would you... how far along? Maybe 6 weeks? Since redemption, probably. Caleb sat back on his heels, running a hand through his hair. She could see him calculating, planning, his mind already racing ahead to all the new challenges a baby would bring. We need a real house, he said finally. Not this canvas shelter. A proper house with walls and a roof and a floor that isn't dirt. And we need more food stored up, more wood cut for winter, more of everything. Caleb, we don't even know for sure yet. We treat it as certain until we know otherwise, he said firmly, which means we work twice as hard and prepare for 3 instead of 2. The news changed something fundamental in how they approached each day. Caleb became almost obsessive about building a proper dwelling, working from before dawn until well after dark, cutting logs and hauling stones. Lila tried to help but found herself exhausted more easily. The pregnancy, if that's what it was, draining her energy in ways the hard work alone hadn't. Their neighbor Marcus appeared one afternoon, riding a mule and carrying a haunch of venison. Saw your smoke, he said, dismounting. Thought I'd check on you youngsters, see how you're faring. We're managing, Caleb said, though the exhaustion in his voice told a different story. Marcus's sharp eyes took in the partially constructed cabin, the evidence of their frantic work, and Lila's wan appearance. Your wife expecting? The directness of the question startled them both. How did you... Lila started. I've seen that look before. My own wife had it 3 times. Marcus's expression softened. Having a baby out here is no small thing. You're going to need help. We'll manage, Caleb said again, but this time Marcus shook his head. Pride, he said, just like I warned you about. Listen, son, there's a woman named Clara Hutchins, lives about 5 miles southwest of here with her husband. She's helped deliver half the babies in the territory. When your wife's time comes, you get Clara. Understand? We can't afford, Caleb began. Nobody's asking you to afford anything. Out here, we help each other because we're all we've got. You need Clara, you send for her. When my fence needs mending next spring, maybe you help me with that. That's how it works. The kindness in Marcus's gruff voice made Lila's throat tight with emotion. Thank you, she managed. Marcus left them the venison and a sack of dried beans, refusing to take any payment. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better, he said. Pay it forward when you're established and some other desperate fool shows up trying to make a go of it. After he left, Lila and Caleb looked at each other, both shaken by the encounter. We're not alone out here, Lila said softly. I was starting to feel like we were the only people in the world. We're not, Caleb agreed. But that doesn't mean we can rely on other people's charity. We still need to make this work on our own. Over the next 2 months, Caleb built a cabin with the single-minded focus of a man running out of time. It was rough, nothing like the houses back in Texas, but it had 4 walls, a proper roof, a stone fireplace, and windows that Lila had insisted on. The floor was packed dirt for now, but Caleb promised he'd add wooden planks when they could afford the lumber. They moved into the cabin just as the first snow began to fall. It felt like a palace after weeks in the canvas shelter. They had a door that closed, walls that blocked the wind, a fireplace that kept them warm. It was barely 12 by 14 feet, exactly the minimum required by the land office. But it was theirs. The crops came in just before the hard frost hit. The yield was poor. They'd planted too late and the soil was still rough, but they harvested enough potatoes and turnips to supplement their stores. The wheat would winter over and hopefully provide a better harvest in the spring. Winter arrived with brutal swiftness. One day it was merely cold. The next day a blizzard swept down from the north, burying their cabin in snow and trapping them inside for 3 days. They huddled by the fire, rationing food and fuel, listening to the wind scream like something alive and angry. Marcus wasn't exaggerating about the winters, Lila said, wrapped in every blanket they owned. No, Caleb agreed grimly. He wasn't. When the storm finally broke, they dug themselves out to find a world transformed. Snow stretched in every direction, pristine and deadly beautiful. Their woodpile, which had seemed adequate, now looked dangerously small. I need to cut more wood, Caleb said, already reaching for his axe. It's too cold. You'll freeze out there. Then I'll freeze, because if we run out of fuel, we both die. He spent every day that winter wasn't actively storming, cutting, and hauling wood. Lila watched him come back each evening half frozen, his beard crusted with ice, his hand so cold he could barely hold the axe. She warmed him by the fire, rubbed feeling back into his fingers, and pretended not to see the fear in his eyes when he looked at their dwindling food supplies. They were hungry that winter. Not starving, they had enough to survive, but never full, never satisfied. Lila's pregnancy became more obvious as her belly swelled despite the meager rations. She felt the baby move for the first time in late December, a flutter like butterfly wings that made her cry with a mixture of joy and terror. We're going to bring a child into this, she said to Caleb that night, her hand on her stomach. Into cold and hunger and danger. What kind of parents does that make us? The kind who are trying to build something better, Caleb said, his hand covering hers. This won't last forever, Lila. Next year will be easier. We'll have a full growing season, more land broken, better preparation. This winter is just survival, but we're surviving. In January, during a brief warm spell, Marcus appeared again with his wife Clara, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and capable hands. She examined Lila with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this many times. Baby's strong, she announced. Due sometime in late April or early May, I'd say. You eating enough? We're eating what we have, Lila said carefully. Clara's expression tightened. That's not what I asked. A pregnant woman needs meat, eggs, vegetables, not just beans and potatoes. We're managing, Caleb said, but Clara cut him off with a look. Men, she said to Lila. Always thinking hardship builds character. Here's what's going to happen. Every week, weather permitting, I'm going to bring you a basket. Eggs, some preserved vegetables from my root cellar, maybe some dried meat. You're going to eat it all and get strong for this baby. We can't accept... Caleb started, but Clara held up a hand. You can and you will. That baby needs its mother healthy. And next fall, when you've got crops to spare, you'll help out someone else who needs it. That's how we survive out here. Together. After they left, Caleb punched the wall hard enough to split his knuckles. Lila looked at him in alarm. What was that for? I hate this, he said through clenched teeth. Hate that I can't provide for you properly. That you're going hungry because I couldn't plant early enough, couldn't prepare well enough, couldn't... Stop, Lila said, crossing to him and taking his bleeding hand in hers. We're alive. We have shelter. We're making it through this winter, and when spring comes, we'll do better. That's all we can do. Survive this season and prepare for the next. But surviving was harder than she'd made it sound. February brought another series of blizzards, each one worse than the last. They ran out of coffee, then salt, then lamp oil. They burned green wood when the dry ran out, filling the cabin with smoke that made their eyes water. Lila developed a cough that wouldn't go away. Caleb's hands, damaged from months of hard labor and repeated frostbite, could barely grip his tools. There were nights when Lila lay awake listening to the wind howl and wondered if they would actually make it, if spring would come in time, if the baby growing inside her would ever see sunlight. But spring did come, slowly and grudgingly. The snow melted, revealing dead grass and mud and their cabin looking worse for the winter's wear. But they had survived. Against all odds, through cold and hunger and fear, they had survived. We made it, Lila said, standing outside on the first truly warm day, feeling the sun on her face. First winter down, Caleb said, his arm around her shoulders. 4 more to go until the land is ours. 4 more winters. The thought should have been daunting, but instead Lila felt something like pride. They had survived the worst. Everything else was just details. As her pregnancy advanced, Caleb became obsessively protective. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy, insisted she rest more, fretted over every twinge and discomfort. It was sweet and suffocating in equal measure. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she said after he'd scolded her for trying to haul water from the well. "You're carrying our child, and I'm not taking any chances." The baby came in late April, 3 weeks earlier than Clara had predicted. Lila's water broke while she was feeding the chickens, and Caleb ran the 5 miles to fetch Clara in record time. The labor was long and brutal, lasting through an entire day and into the next night. Clara stayed with her throughout, offering encouragement and practical guidance while Caleb paced outside, forbidden from the birthing room like all men were. When the baby finally came, a girl with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly, Lila held her daughter and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what she was capable of surviving. "She's perfect," she whispered, exhausted and elated in equal measure. Clara cleaned the baby and wrapped her in soft cloth before laying her in Caleb's arms. He looked down at his daughter with an expression of such wonder and terror that Lila felt tears spring to her eyes. "What do we name her?" he asked softly. Lila had thought about this through the long winter nights. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope, because that's what this child represented. Hope that they could build a life here, that their choice had been the right one, that everything they'd endured had purpose and meaning." Caleb nodded, tears tracking down his weathered face. "Hope Boone. Welcome to the world, little one. It's hard and cold and sometimes cruel, but it's ours, and we're going to make it better for you." Clara stayed with them for 3 days, teaching Lila how to nurse, how to swaddle, how to read the baby's different cries. Then she left them to figure out the rest on their own, with a promise to check back in a week. Those first weeks with Hope were a blur of sleepless nights and steep learning curves. The baby needed constant attention, and Lila's body needed time to heal. Caleb took over all the physical work, planting the spring crops, tending the animals, hauling water, cutting wood. He came in each night exhausted and often fell asleep sitting up with Hope in his arms while Lila tried to grab a few hours of rest. But through it all, despite the exhaustion and the continued struggle, something had changed. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building something, a family, a life, a future that belonged to them and no one else. One evening in early summer, with Hope sleeping in a cradle Caleb had built and the crops growing strong in fields they had broken themselves, Lila sat on the porch Caleb had finally finished and watched the sun set over their land. Caleb joined her, settling onto the rough wooden planks with a contented sigh. "Year and a half," he said. "We've been here a year and a half. 3.5 more to go." "We're going to make it," Lila said, and this time it wasn't hope or determination talking. It was certainty. "Yeah," Caleb agreed, taking her hand. "We are." The years that followed Hope's birth were a study in incremental victories and persistent hardships. Each season brought its own challenges, its own tests of their resolve. The second winter was marginally easier than the first. They had more food stored, more wood cut, better understanding of what the land demanded. But it was still brutal, still a fight for survival measured in degrees of cold and dwindling supplies. Spring always came as a resurrection, the land thawing and greening with a speed that seemed miraculous after months of white desolation. That second spring, Caleb broke twice as much ground as the year before, his hands now permanently scarred and calloused, his body leaner and harder than it had been in Texas. Lila worked beside him when she could, Hope strapped to her back in a carrier Clara had shown her how to make, the baby's dark eyes watching everything with solemn curiosity. By their 3rd year on the land, patterns had emerged. They knew which fields drained well and which held water too long. They knew when to expect the last frost and when the first snow would likely fall. They'd learned to read the sky for weather, to judge the health of their crops by the color of the leaves, to stretch meager supplies through careful rationing and creative cooking. Their small herd had grown, 2 cows now, along with the chickens and a pig Marcus had helped them acquire. The animals meant milk and eggs and eventually meat, resources that transformed their diet from bare subsistence to something approaching adequacy. Hope thrived, growing from infant to toddler to a small child with her mother's determination and her father's quiet strength. But success, when it came slowly. Too slowly. In their 4th year, a late spring frost killed half their wheat crop. In their 5th year, a summer drought withered their vegetables before they could mature. Each setback felt like the land testing them, asking if they had the fortitude to keep trying when trying seemed futile. "We're barely breaking even," Caleb said one night late in their 5th year, reviewing their accounts by lamplight. Hope was asleep in the small bedroom they'd added to the cabin, and Lila was mending one of Caleb's shirts, the 3rd time she'd patched the same tear. 5 years of work and we're just surviving. Not thriving, just surviving. We own the land now, Lila reminded him. The 5-year proving period had ended 3 months earlier, and the deed was officially theirs, signed and recorded. That counts for something. Does it? We own land we can barely coax a living from, land that fights us every season. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion making him unusually candid. Sometimes I wonder if we should sell it. Take what we could get and move somewhere easier. The words hung in the air like smoke. Lila set down her mending and looked at her husband, really looked at him. He was 34 now, but he looked older, weathered by years of relentless labor. His hands were gnarled from constant work and repeated injuries. His face was deeply lined from squinting against sun and wind. This land had aged him in ways that normal years never would have. "Do you mean that?" she asked quietly. "About selling?" Caleb was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "Some days I think we're fools for staying, that we're sacrificing ourselves for dirt and rocks and stubborn pride. Other days I think we're so close to turning the corner to making this actually work, that leaving now would be throwing away everything we've built." "What changed?" Lila asked. "You were so certain when we started, so determined." "I was younger, stupider. I thought determination was enough." He gestured around the cabin, at their modest improvements, at the life they'd carved from nothing. "And we've accomplished something. I'm not saying we haven't, but at what cost? Look at you, Lila. You were 22 when we came here. You should be in your prime, but you look—" "Worn out?" she supplied. "Older than my years? I know. I own a mirror, Caleb." "That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is, and you're right. This life has aged both of us. But we knew it would be hard. We chose it anyway. We chose it before we understood what hard really meant." Caleb stood and walked to the window, staring out at darkness broken only by starlight. "I watch Hope growing up out here with no other children to play with. No school, no opportunities beyond what we can provide. Is that fair to her? Are we being good parents or selfish ones?" The question struck at fears Lila had been harboring but hadn't voiced. Hope was almost 5 years old now, bright and curious, and growing up in virtual isolation. The nearest neighbor children were 10 miles away. There was no school, no church social, no community beyond the scattered settlers who checked on each other when weather allowed. "What's the alternative?" Lila asked. "Move back east? Live in a town where you work for someone else and we rent a house we'll never own? Where Hope grows up comfortable but we spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been. At least we'd be together. At least she'd have a future beyond—" He gestured vaguely at the window, at the dark land beyond. "Beyond what? Freedom? Space? Parents who chose each other and chose this life deliberately?" Lila stood and crossed to him. "I know it's hard, Caleb. Some days I'm so tired I can barely stand. Some days I miss my mother so much it physically hurts. But I don't regret coming here, not for a second. Even when we're eating turnips for the 3rd meal in a row? Even then." He pulled her close and they stood together in the dim lamplight, both wrestling with doubts that 5 years of hardship had earned them the right to feel. The conversation might have ended there, might have been just another moment of doubt weathered and survived, except that 2 days later, a rider appeared on the horizon. Visitors were rare enough to be noteworthy. Caleb grabbed his rifle, caution born of years on the frontier, but the rider raised a hand in greeting as he approached, clearly not hostile. "Caleb Boone," the man called out, reining in his horse a respectful distance from the cabin. "That's right. And you are?" "Name's Patterson. I'm a land agent working for the railroad. They're planning to run a line through this territory, and I'm here to make you an offer." Lila felt her stomach drop. Railroad meant development. Development meant their isolated existence was about to change, one way or another. Patterson dismounted and pulled papers from his saddlebag. "The railroad is willing to pay fair market value for homesteads in the path of the proposed line. Your section falls directly in the corridor we need." "We're not interested in selling," Caleb said immediately, but Patterson held up a hand. "Hear me out. I'm authorized to offer you $2,000 for your 160 acres. That's more than triple what most land out here is worth. With that kind of money, you could relocate to better farmland, or move to a town and start a business, or, we said we're not interested, Caleb repeated, but Lila heard the hesitation in his voice. $2,000. It was more money than they'd seen in their entire lives, more money than they'd likely earn from this land in the next 10 years. Don't decide right now, Patterson said, apparently used to resistance. Think about it. Talk it over. I'll be back through in 2 weeks for your answer. He remounted his horse. $2,000, Mr. Boone. That's a life-changing sum for folks in your position. Think carefully before you refuse it. After he rode away, Lila and Caleb looked at each other, both shaken. $2,000, Caleb said softly. I know. We could buy established farmland somewhere easier, or a house in a real town. Hope could go to school. You could what? Go back to being a proper lady? Lila shook her head. I'm not that person anymore, Caleb. I don't think I ever really was. But the money is just money. This land is ours. We earned it. Every acre, every building, every fence post. It's ours in a way nothing else could ever be. Caleb walked a slow circle around their yard, looking at everything they'd built with new eyes. The cabin, expanded now to include 2 bedrooms and a real floor. The barn, built painstakingly over 2 summers. The fenced pastures, the well with its stone lining, the root cellar, the chicken coop. 5 years of work made visible in wood and stone and sweat. What if they force us, he asked. Railroads have power. They can claim eminent domain, take the land anyway. Then we fight them. But we don't just hand it over because they wave money at us. Hope emerged from the cabin then, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She was a beautiful child, all dark curls and serious eyes, her face already showing the structure of the woman she'd become. Papa? She said, wrapping her arms around Caleb's leg. Who was that man? Caleb picked her up, holding her close. Just a man making us an offer, sweetheart. Are we leaving? Hope's eyes went wide with alarm. I don't want to leave. This is home. Out of the mouths of children, Lila thought. This is home. Not just a place they were trying to prove up, or a bet they were trying to win, but home. The only home Hope had ever known. We're not leaving, Lila said firmly, and saw relief flood Caleb's face as the decision crystallized between them. We're not leaving, he echoed. The next 2 weeks were tense with anticipation. They worked the land as they always had, but now with a new awareness of how much it meant to them, how deeply they'd rooted themselves here. Neighbors began stopping by. Word of the railroad's offer had spread quickly, and Lila realized they'd built more of a community than she'd recognized. Marcus and Clara, the Hutchins family to the south, the young couple, Daniel and Emma, who'd claimed land to the east 3 years back, a dozen other families scattered across the territory, all connected by the shared experience of trying to build lives from nothing. Railroads offering everyone the same deal, Marcus said, sitting on their porch one evening. $2,000 per section. Most folks are planning to take it. Not you? Caleb asked. Hell no. Buried my wife here last year. I'm not leaving her behind for any amount of money. Marcus spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Besides, where would I go? I'm too old to start over somewhere else and too stubborn to quit before I absolutely have to. We're not selling either, Lila said. Good, because if this territory gets bought up by the railroad, it'll change everything. Won't be homesteaders anymore, just hired hands working for the company. And that's not what any of us came here for. When Patterson returned 2 weeks later, he found not just Caleb and Lila waiting, but a dozen other homesteaders gathered in solidarity. We've discussed your offer, Caleb said, speaking for the group, and we're refusing it, all of us. This land is ours, legally claimed and proved up. You can't have it. Patterson's expression hardened. The railroad will build through here whether you cooperate or not. If you refuse to sell, they'll find ways to make your lives difficult. Cutting off access to markets, refusing to ship your goods, making sure no supplies reach you. Are you prepared for that? We've survived 5 years of winters that tried to kill us, Lila said, stepping forward. We'll survive whatever the railroad throws at us, too. You're making a mistake, Patterson warned. Maybe, Caleb agreed, but it's our mistake to make. Patterson left angry, and for a while it seemed like his threats might come to nothing. But 6 months later, when Caleb tried to ship their wheat harvest to market, he found that the railroad, now built and running just 5 miles south of their land, refused to transport goods from non-cooperative homesteaders. Other merchants, dependent on railroad shipping for their own businesses, followed suit, effectively cutting the holdout settlers off from wider markets. It could have been devastating, should have been devastating. But what the railroad hadn't counted on was the stubborn self-reliance they'd tried to crush. The homesteaders who'd refused to sell banded together, creating their own market cooperative. They pooled resources, shared equipment, and found alternative routes to sell their goods. Longer routes, harder routes, but routes that didn't require railroad cooperation. The first year was brutal. The second was better. By the third year, their cooperative had grown strong enough to negotiate from a position of power, and the railroad, realizing these settlers weren't going to break, finally relented and began accepting their shipments again. Lila stood in the field one harvest morning in their 10th year on the land, watching Caleb and Hope working together to gather wheat. Hope was 9 now, capable and confident, handling adult work with practiced ease. The harvest was good, their best yet. The railroad ran to the south, close enough to be convenient, but not so close as to dominate their lives. The cabin had been expanded again, now including a proper parlor and a second story. The barn housed 4 cows, 2 horses, a dozen chickens, and 3 pigs. Their fields stretched green and gold toward the horizon. "Ma," Hope called out, "come look at this." Lila walked over to where Hope was pointing at something in the wheat, a nest, cleverly hidden, with 4 speckled eggs inside. "Should we take them?" Hope asked. "Leave them," Lila said. "Let the bird have her family. We have enough." And they did. For the first time since arriving in the territory, they had enough. Not abundance. This land would never offer easy abundance, but enough to eat well, to save a little, to plan for futures beyond simple survival. That evening, with Hope asleep and the autumn wind beginning to carry the first hints of coming winter, Lila and Caleb sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. 10 years, Caleb said quietly. Has it been everything you hoped for? Lila considered the question seriously. Her hands were scarred and rough, her body marked by years of hard labor and childbirth. She would never be the proper young lady her mother had raised her to be. Her life bore no resemblance to the comfortable existence she would have had as William Garrett's wife. "No," she said finally, and felt Caleb tense beside her. "It's been harder, more painful, more frightening, more uncertain." She took his hand, feeling the familiar roughness of his palm against hers. "But it's also been more real, more honest, more mine. So no, it hasn't been everything I hoped for. It's been something different, something better." Even with all the struggles? Especially with all the struggles. Easy things don't change you. They don't test you or teach you or show you what you're capable of. We came here with nothing but hope and determination, and we built this. She gestured at the land around them, at the life they'd created. "That means something." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I used to be terrified I'd fail you, that I'd bring you out here and not be able to make it work. And now? Now I realize we were never going to make it work alone. It took both of us. Your strength, your refusal to give up even when things looked hopeless. My stubbornness, maybe. But mostly your belief that we could do this." "We did do this," Lila corrected. "Past tense. The land is ours. The life is ours. We proved everyone wrong. My father, the doubters, probably even ourselves." She thought about her father then, for the first time in months. She'd sent him one letter years ago, telling him she was alive and well. He'd never responded. Her mother had died 3 years back. Lila had learned it through a chance encounter with a traveler from Texas. The news had grieved her deeply, but she'd made peace with her choices long ago. Her mother had chosen to stay. Lila had chosen to leave. Neither choice was wrong. They were simply different. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd taken the railroad's offer?" Caleb asked. "Sometimes. But then I think about what we'd have lost. Not just the land, but the knowledge that we could survive anything, that we're strong enough, together, to face whatever comes. Think Hope will stay when she's grown? Or will she run from this life like we ran from Texas?" It was a question Lila had pondered often. "I think she'll choose her own path, whatever that is. But at least she'll know she has the strength to choose. That's what we've given her, not comfort or ease, but the example of people who chose their own lives and made it work. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Hope appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket against the cooling evening. "Can't sleep?" Lila asked. "Not yet. Can I sit with you?" They made room, and Hope settled between them, small and warm and absolutely theirs. "Tell me again," Hope said, as she often did on quiet evenings, "about how you and Papa met." So Lila told the story. The creek, the rescue, the 7 years of watching and waiting. Hope had heard it 100 times, but never tired of it, always entranced by the idea of her parents as young people making brave choices. "Were you scared?" Hope asked when the story reached the part about running away. "Terrified," Lila admitted, "but being scared doesn't mean you don't do the thing. It just means you do it while being scared." "What if you'd been caught?" "Then we'd have dealt with that." "But we weren't, and here we are." Hope was quiet for a moment, processing this. "I want to be brave like you when I grow up." "You already are," Caleb said, pulling his daughter close. "You're growing up in one of the hardest places in the world, and you're thriving. That takes a special kind of bravery." As the stars began to emerge overhead, Lila felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This life had been harder than anything she'd imagined. It had tested her in ways she'd never anticipated, but it had also revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed. The following spring brought another challenge, a late frost that threatened their wheat crop. But this time, instead of panic, Lila felt a calm certainty. They would handle it, whatever came. They always did. By their 15th year on the land, their homestead had become one of the most successful in the territory. Other settlers came to Caleb for advice on crop rotation and soil management. They came to Lila for help with preserving food and managing households on limited resources. The cooperative they'd helped establish had grown into a real force, giving small farmers bargaining power they'd never had before. Hope grew into a young woman of 16, strong and capable, and filled with dreams that stretched beyond the homestead. She wanted to be a teacher, she'd announced one evening, wanted to start a school for the scattered children of the territory so they wouldn't have to grow up without education. "How would we manage that?" Caleb had asked, proud and concerned in equal measure. "Same way you managed building a life from nothing," Hope had answered with her mother's determination in her eyes. "One step at a time." They helped her apply for teaching certification through a correspondence course, scraping together the fees from their slowly growing savings. Watching Hope pursue her own dreams, Lila felt the circle complete. They'd chosen their path so Hope could choose hers. 20 years after fleeing into the night, Lila stood in the same field where she'd watched the sunset on their 10th anniversary. She was 42 now, her dark hair liberally threaded with silver, her face lined by sun and wind and laughter. Caleb, 49, stood beside her, surveying their land with satisfaction. "You know what I realized?" Lila said. "What's that?" "I'm older now than my mother was when I left, and I'm happier than she ever was." "Think she'd be proud of you?" "If she could see this?" Lila considered. "I think she'd be baffled. She couldn't understand choosing hardship over security, but maybe she'd be a little envious too, of the fact that I got to choose." The homestead had evolved beyond recognition from those early desperate years. A proper 2-story house now stood where the cabin had been. The cabin itself converted into a storage building. The barn was large and well-maintained, housing livestock that represented real wealth. Fields of wheat and corn and vegetables stretched in all directions. They'd planted an orchard of apple trees that were finally beginning to bear fruit. Hope had opened her school in a building the community had built together, and 15 children from the surrounding homesteads attended regularly. She was engaged to marry Daniel and Emma's son Thomas next spring, a quiet young man who worked his parents' land with the same determination Hope brought to teaching. "We should have a party," Caleb said suddenly. "A real celebration. 20 years on this land. That's worth marking." So they did. In late summer, they hosted a gathering that brought together everyone in the territory. Over 50 people crowded onto their land for a day of food and music and storytelling. Marcus, now in his 70s and still impossibly stubborn, raised a toast to the homesteaders who'd refused the railroad's money and built something lasting instead. As the sun set and the party continued by firelight, Lila found herself standing apart from the crowd for a moment, looking at everything they'd built. Not just the physical structures, but the community, the relationships, the sense of belonging that had grown from those early desperate days. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, appearing beside her with 2 cups of the hard cider Marcus had brought. "That we did it," Lila said simply. "Everything we said we'd do. We built a life. We raised a daughter. We created something from nothing. With a lot of help," Caleb reminded her. "With help," she agreed. "But it started with us, with 2 people who refused to settle for lives other people planned for them." "Any regrets?" Lila turned to look at him, this man she'd loved for more than half her life, who'd aged and weathered and grown alongside her. "Not a single one," she said. "You?" "Just that I didn't ask you to run away with me 7 years earlier." She laughed and kissed him, not caring who saw. After 20 years of marriage, they'd earned the right to their affection. As the party wound down and neighbors began the journey back to their own homesteads, Hope approached her parents where they sat on the porch steps. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Lila asked. "For showing me what it looks like to build a life on your own terms. For teaching me that hard and worth it aren't contradictory." Hope sat down beside them. "Thomas and I were talking. After we marry, we want to claim land to the west, start our own homestead." Lila felt her chest tighten, fear for her daughter's future mixing with pride at her courage. "It'll be hard," Caleb warned. "I know. You taught me that, but you also taught me I'm strong enough to handle hard." That night, lying in bed beside Caleb, Lila thought about the circle of life, how they'd fled to create something new, and now their daughter was doing the same. Not running from something, but toward something. The distinction mattered. The years continued their relentless march. Hope married Thomas and claimed their land. Caleb and Lila became grandparents, twice over within 3 years. The railroad that had once threatened their existence became an asset, making it easier to ship their goods and receive supplies. The territory grew more settled, though it never lost its fundamental wildness. On the morning of their 30th anniversary on the land, Lila woke before dawn and slipped outside to watch the sunrise. She was 52 now, her body bearing the marks of hard decades, but still strong, still capable. Caleb was 59, his dark hair almost completely silver, his hands permanently gnarled from years of labor. She heard him come outside, felt him settle beside her on the porch steps they'd sat on thousands of mornings before. 30 years, he said softly. "Hard to believe." "Longer than my father's entire relationship with his land," Lila observed, "and we own ours free and clear. No debts, no mortgages, no one can take it from us." "What do you think he'd say if he could see this? Your father?" Lila considered. Her father had died 5 years back, never having reconciled with her choice. The news had come through Marcus, who'd heard it from a traveler. She'd grieved the relationship they'd never repaired, but not the choice that had broken it. "I think he'd see the success, the land, the prosperity, the grandchildren. But I don't think he'd understand the why of it. That we did this not despite the hardship, but because the hardship made it ours." The sun broke over the horizon, painting their fields gold. This land that had tried to break them, that had tested them in every conceivable way, had instead made them stronger, together. "If you could go back," Caleb asked, "knowing everything that would happen, the struggles, the losses, the hard winters and harder seasons, would you still do it?" Lila didn't need to think about her answer. In a heartbeat, every frozen morning and hungry night and moment of doubt, I'd do it all again for the freedom to choose my own life. Even the parts that hurt? Especially the parts that hurt, because those are the parts that proved we were strong enough, that we could survive anything as long as we survived it together. They sat in silence as the day brightened around them. 2 people who'd gambled everything on love and determination, and won. Not easily, not painlessly, but completely. That evening, as they did most evenings, they sat on their porch watching the sunset. But this time, surrounded by family, Hope and Thomas, their grandchildren playing in the yard, neighbors stopping by to mark the anniversary, Lila felt the weight of 30 years settle around her like a comfortable blanket. "Tell us the story," one of the grandchildren demanded, as children always did. "About how Grandma and Grandpa ran away." So Lila told it again, the story that had become family legend. The desperate flight, the wedding in Redemption, the brutal first winter, the fight to keep their land when the railroad came. She told it with the perspective of 3 decades, able now to see the whole arc of it, how the scared 22-year-old girl who'd ridden through the night had become this woman, weathered and wise and content. When the story ended and the children ran off to play, Hope settled beside her mother. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd stayed? Married William Garrett?" "Sometimes," Lila admitted. "I'd probably be comfortable, well-fed, bored out of my mind and dying slowly inside." "You think it's better to have lived hard than to have lived easy?" Lila looked at her daughter, at the calluses on Hope's hands that matched her own, at the strength in her bearing that came from choosing difficulty over comfort. "I think it's better to have lived deliberately," she said, "to have made your own choices and owned the consequences. Easy or hard doesn't matter nearly as much as authentic versus borrowed." As the stars emerged and the family gradually dispersed, Thomas taking the children home, neighbors riding back to their own lands, Lila and Caleb found themselves alone again, just as they'd been on so many nights before. 30 years, Caleb said again, like he still couldn't quite believe it. "And however many more we get," Lila added, "think we'll make it to 40? At this point, I think we're too stubborn to die." He laughed and pulled her close, and they sat together under the vast western sky. Two people who'd chosen the hard path and found it led exactly where they needed to go. The land stretched around them in the darkness, their land, earned through years of struggle and determination and refusal to quit. Not the easy inheritance of her father's failing ranch, not the comfortable prison of William Garrett's money, but something real and hard-won and completely theirs. Somewhere in the night, an owl called. The wind rustled through wheat fields ready for harvest. A horse nickered softly in the barn they'd built with their own hands. This was what success looked like, Lila thought, not wealth or status or the approval of people who'd never understood her choice. But this, a life built deliberately, a love chosen freely, a future earned rather than inherited. She'd left home with nothing but hope and courage. She'd survived winters that should have killed her, hardships that should have broken her, doubts that should have sent her running back to safety. Instead, she'd built an empire of dirt and dreams, had raised a daughter who understood that strength came from choosing your own path, had loved a man through every season of their lives and found that love deepened rather than faded with time. "No regrets?" Caleb asked one more time, like he still needed to hear the answer. Lila looked at the land they'd tamed, the house they'd built, the life they'd created from nothing but determination and hope. She thought of the scared girl who'd ridden through the night toward an uncertain future, and the woman she'd become through 3 decades of choosing courage over comfort. "Not one," she said firmly, "not a single one." And as they sat together in the darkness, listening to the land settle around them, Lila knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. Not the easy choice, not the expected choice, but hers. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered.